I like Techland. They're so hit and miss it's kind of impressive, but when they make a good game, it is good. Now, I'm going to grant I've only played games from 2 of their series, and even then, not all of them. See that bastard there? That's the one I'm playing. Bit weird to put it with the Dead Island, since, it's only a spiritual sequel. So, Dead Island was a bit boring. It probably would have been boring even with a more accurate trailer, but this trailer implied sadness and drama instead of Sam B, which is arguably better anyway. Now, there is actually going to be a Dead Island 2 in case anyone was somehow concerned, but that's gone to Jaeger Entertainment as Techland has split with series developer Deep Silver over creative differences. Presumably they didn't want Techland stealing gameplay from their own series, and Mirror's Edge, both villains from Far Cry 3, and making the game actually enjoyable. This is the first free roamer I've played in quite a long while that actually held my attention for a decent amount of time, and while I didn't 100% it, I did beat the main story, have a chinwag with a few locals, and knocked about the city a bit. Even knocked a few zombies about as well. Spoilers ahead, because I'm going to do the story in one go this time because of reasons. Feel free to skip over to gameplay. I'll most likely still be talking at that point. It opens with us parachuting into the quarantined city of Haran. We're playing as Special Agent Kyle Crane, working for the GRE. They all turn out to be evil at some point. Sorry for spoiling events that happened 5 minutes in. Crane is developing a style of martial art that requires a complete lack of self-preservation, and as the only man or 4 with infinite lives, he's probably the only one capable of mastering this style and saving Haran. However, Crane fucks up in record time. Gets hit, gets bit, gets rescued, and in an effort to spare Crane's feelings of humiliation, one of his saviors decides to fuck up even worse. Crane passes out and awakes sometime later, now infected and dependent on antizin, which he gets 1 dose of. It's at this point that it's wise to go and do a whole ton of side quests instead, because encroaching zombification is only advanced in the plot, so it's probably in our best medical interest to hold off on that.
Yeah, I've got some alcohol.
Thank you. Oh, this is gonna be a big help. But, is that all you could find?
So, Crane's in this shithole to look for a bloke called Suleiman, and nick some file that he nicked first. At first we think Suleiman might be running the tower, the group of survivors we ended up with, but by doing a parkour tutorial we learn that it's just a bloke named Brecken. And who we're actually after is the warlord of a group of absolute bastards about 10 minutes walk from the tower, and his name is Rais. Here he is chopping someone's arm off. So, Crane ends up joining the tower to keep tabs on the two, especially Rais since he has that file we're after. The tower is a group of benevolent survivors who keep stockpiles of antizin for those who are infected, gather resources to give out freely to their inhabitants, and keep a quartermaster to stock their runners who go out to get said supplies. They also teach all of their members parkour so effectively that they can pick it up in about a day and master it within a couple of weeks.
Don't move! I'll get help!
Ha! I was just fucking with you!
Son of a bitch!
What?
There's also someone called Rahim, who sits around complaining for much of the time you spend with him.
So now you take the... I don't have time to deal with your bullshit.
Meanwhile, Rise's lads work for a man who is a composite of both villains from Far Cry 3, and somehow still dumber than that way of putting it. His hobbies include torture, and shooting his own men in front of the protagonist. He acts like he embodies chaos, so he tries to turn the conflict with the protagonist into some kind of philosophical standpoint. He is quite possibly the most stupid villain I've ever seen. Plus, none of his men can do parkour. They just sit around loot boxes waiting to die. The tower is running short of antizin, so we go and get some, but the GRE tells us to dump it so that the tower will have to go through Rise and thus force contact between the two groups. Crane does it because he hasn't made his heroic turn yet. Just a note, but if the world seems to drain of colour when you're talking to your employer, chances are they're probably evil. So then we go and do some dealing with Rise, do some jobs for the guy being a professional dickhead for a little while.
I'll tell you what. How about I break both your legs and drag you through the streets back to Rice's place, huh? And then he can explain to you that you should have cooperated.
Okay. Jesus. You are one of Rice's thugs.
Kareem, it's me. So I just threatened to break an old man's legs.
And it worked, didn't it?
And then he only gives us a few vials, because it turns out that a cunt is a cunt.
You promised me 2 crates of it. This is only 5 vials.
Oh, and while this is happening, a doctor called Zero is working on a cure. Something to do with zombies that only come out at night. Oh, and while this is happening, Rahim dies blowing up a tower full of ultra zombies. Oh, well, he dies before that point and has us do it. It's mostly agreed that his death was pointless. Oh, by the way, Jade is his sister, and it turns out that she's not all that big on this. So she runs away and on the way out grabs Zera's research, which just had a breakthrough by the way. And this is handy for us because Zera is kidnapped and killed moments later. In our failed attempt to save him, we end up thrown into a gladiatorial pit that I knew I was going to be thrown into because it was established earlier and the whole mission to save Zera is called the Pit. It's that clairvoyance that keeps Crane alive and gets his allies killed. We beat the pits, Rais releases the file that we're after, and it proves the GRE was actually trying to weaponize the virus, because, well, I guess the Deadly Plague game is lucrative for a bizarrely ran humanitarian company. We cut Rais's arm off, see Zera die, and then we sod off to get smuggled into Old Town. Once there, we run into a woman named Troy.
Crane, one more thing, mate. Do you remember that girl from Sector Zero, Troy?
Nope. I mean, we've had like 10 characters, maybe more than that, and they've only had 1.5 scenes each. And none were particularly memorable. Raheem died, I remember him. The government is about to bomb Haran and is saying no one in the city is left alive to avoid all the bad press, to the point of cutting communication with the city. We decide to bomb the city a bit ourselves to show that we don't need the help and that they can go away. It doesn't work, so instead we end up doing the stupid thing and climbing a radio tower to tell everyone else to fuck off. Also, the GRE tries backpedaling.
All you need to do is to bring Dr. Zera's research with you, and we'll send a nice, safe helicopter to extract
You realize I know what was in the file.
While we're doing all this, Crane is constantly trying to call Jade. She's busy ignoring him and getting kidnapped. Then it turns out she's at a museum. We swim to a museum.
There's an entrance under the surface of Emerald Pond, but it would be a long swim under the water. You would most likely drown.
Yeah, well, most likely isn't definitely, so guess I'll give it a try.
Gotta appreciate that confidence. We start zombifying, and Jade is zombifying, and she gives us anti-zombification drugs. Then we kill Rais's right-hand man, but now Rais has half the research Jade had, and he's going to go and give it to the GRE, and then he somehow zombifies all of his own troops and climbs a tower with a rocket launcher where he yells at you with a loudspeaker and shoots rockets at you. Also, you give half of your research to someone called Camden, who Zera knew, and he can make a cure, but only if he had double the amount of research you gave him, and then you realise that Rais has the other half, and that other half makes double. So you climb the tower, and Rais has only had time to prepare a QTE, and it ends disappointingly. More so for Rais.
That's that for a decision, asshole!
So yeah, the story is more than a little weak. The strongest point is the protagonist Carl Crane, because outside of a cutscene or two where he comes off as a complete tool, he's otherwise earnest and likeable, and he shares my position on Rais.
Do not leave me like this, Crane. Prove you are a man. Take your vengeance.
Will you just shut the fuck up?
He is shallow otherwise, however. Everyone else is plenty forgettable. The story has a decent number of characters, and they just get 1 or 2 scenes each and are then cycled out. A few get relegated to side missions, and some are just kinda there, actively not being interesting.
I'm a goddamn parkour instructor!
I think the funniest case of this is with Raheem. He gets about 3 chats, and most of the time he's acting like an obstructive little shit, or hanging out drunk near the edge of a tower. Then he dies and Crane is all, "He was me best mate! He took the bombs, the nutter!" Rais feels like a parody played straight. He spends most of his time killing his own men and having big dumb philosophical rants. When I said he zombifies all of his own men at the end just to leave them in your path, I'm not joking, he actually somehow did that. It tries so hard to make him come off as a complete monster but just makes him look like an impetuous child. It wants you to hate him so much that it forgets to establish why the fuck anyone else would follow him over the super parkour instructor who lives just 10 minutes away. And because of this, you do spend the whole game wanting to smash his face in, and then all you get for it is a QTE. The problem is that the early game is actually somewhat interesting story-wise, where you wander around the tower and venture out to other survivor communities dotted around, dealing with how the tower and other groups operate. And that interesting side of the story then gets relegated to side quests, and the main plot gets wrapped up in a whole bunch of less interesting shit that at times can feel like a slog. And all of this is for a villain with his head so far up his own arse that he also has his head up the arses of the other 2 villains that he's trying to emulate. The GRE is so obviously evil so quickly that it becomes annoying that the main character plays along for any length of time at all, and by the time he makes his defiant stand against them, it just feels like he's late to the party. I'd say the biggest problem is the lack of urgency. which is a shame because the story really wants urgency. It craves it. You're infected, the town's going to be bombed, Zera's kidnapped and going to be killed, there's an outbreak at the tower and we need drugs. And in each event I buggered off because there was like 5 side quests I wanted to do a bit more. Your infection is only tied to plot events, so the healthiest course of action is to just go off your meds and roam about having fun. No matter what, I'll save Haran in the nick of time. If I held off on this mission for 8 days instead of 7, well, we'd all be in the shit, lads. I am complaining, but honestly, this is for the best. Plus, I just hate the presentation of the cutscenes. Kyle Crane is a man with Steadicam eyes that are somehow capable of zoom and real-time colour correction, and it just comes off as alien and disorienting. And that's saying nothing of his survivor vision where he can just see everything useful around him. The story isn't incredibly bad, it's just serviceable and predictable. I saw it through to the end, it's really not all that memorable. The gameplay challenges and objectives it presents are for the most part interesting when taken on their own, it's just the events stringing them together that are kind of dull. So, as I said way earlier, this is a spiritual successor to Dead Island, but I feel it improves on it in near enough every way, and adds a bunch of new features besides. Firstly, the smallish and somewhat linear zones have been replaced with 2 rather sizable sprawls. Despite this, vehicles have been removed, and luckily the human leg has gotten far better than it was way back in 2011. Kyle smashed into the right side of town and could thus be part of the fast track to free running, and yeah, it's pretty fucking fun. Jumping around town is what I spent a majority of my time doing, and just getting from A to B is actually enjoyable. I feel I've got to clarify at this point that I like first-person platforming. I had no problem gauging jumps, and working out just where I should be jumping. I even prefer this over Mirror's Edge, and I'll grant it's because this is less realistic. Kyle just feels floaty enough, and the fact that you can actually turn in midair opens up ample opportunities for bullshit. Plus you can break your fall and negate all damage by landing on cars and garbage bags. Of course. Both the slums and Old Town areas have tons of little routes through them. The maps aren't huge by any stretch, I'd argue about 20 to 25 minutes to get from one end to the other in a straight. But they are densely packed, well put together, and they have plenty of verticality. If you navigate well, you can almost avoid zombies completely, so it actually rewards knowing the map. All this said, while I do enjoy jumping around, I really dislike the first-person climbing. It's slow, clunky, at times fiddly, and never enjoyable. While it is also insanely easy, the first-person perspective does not do it any favours, and when it does fuck up it feels like the game's at fault for it. It's not like you're running around for nothing. I mean, there is that whole zombie problem causing all of this exercise. The combat is pretty much Dead Island again, but something about it makes it far more satisfying from the get-go. There is some actual crunch to landing hits. Plus the occasional slow motion really works, and the sound effects are perfect. It's got the sound of overblown sharpness with some melee weapons that just makes things feel powerful, and the blunt weapons are no slouches either. The biggest issue I had with Dead Island was that it felt like I was hitting burlap sacks filled with numbers, whereas Dying Light feels more like hitting angry meat. The removal of health bars over enemies definitely helps with this. While I can't remember how it was in Dead Island, the far more limited regenerating health here also makes combat quite risky, and you can be beaten down really quickly if you're caught in a bad spot. Zombies can also grapple you, and while that's not a bad thing in theory, in execution it feels weird. You do get a warning jostle, which, if you're just running around and not fighting, is a good warning to get the fuck out of dodge. But in combat, that warning jostle spins your camera to the zombie grappling you, and it honestly feels like you can just be hit with little recourse. I believe it's supposed to make you gauge when to make swings, or give you a last-ditch moment to strike back, as you have no ways to block. And early on, your only defensive options are backing away, or turning around and backing away forwards faster. That's only at first, mind, and this brings me to leveling your shit. There are 3 separate skill trees, and each level up independently, and all 3 can be maxed out. They are Power, Agility, and Survivor. Each are leveled up by doing relevant things. Hitting zombies gets you Power, jumping over stuff gets you Agility, and objectives and side stuff helps with Survivor. And I really do like leveling in this game. While a few of the skills you can take are just plain percentage boosts, there are very few truly empty levels. And for the most part, new skills grant you new moves, and upgraded versions of those moves actually have a notable difference. You become very versatile as you get more levels. And while the 3 separate trees lead to a constant feeling of improvement, the early game can still feel pretty slow in comparison. Your stamina and running speed only increases once every 5 levels, and the first 2 tiers feel incredibly sluggish, with the first being downright tiny. So there's little flow to parkour at first, as you have to stop for breathers every 20 seconds. One interesting note is that you have 2 stamina bars, one for running and one for combat. Rather than meaning you have to manage both, this usually means you always have a defensive or offensive option available. Agility is by far and away the most enjoyable skill tree. Your first level up grants access to the dodge, which is the first game changer. It gives the combat a far better flow, and the game's fighting feels built around the back and forth it creates. As for other notable unlocks, Vault lets you use zombies as stepping stones. Incredibly fun to do, allows you to be an opportunistic sod no matter where you are, and can be upgraded to stun zombies, which can then be comboed with another skill to instant kill them. You can lower fall damage, and eventually learn to roll to negate pretty large drops entirely. It speaks pretty loudly about the sort of man Kyle Crane is, that he learns to dropkick things before he figures out to roll on landing. The grapple pretty much turns one-on-one fights with zombies into a joke, and it's still helpful for managing groups besides. And when upgraded, can then be comboed with Stomp to instant kill more shit. We get a running tackle for keeping pace through enemies, and then of course there is the dropkick, by far the part of the game that got the most attention. And yeah, it's fucking fun to dropkick things. And in this game too. It's not only really satisfying, but it feels downright encouraged. And practical. Dropkicking is the name of the game. This all said, for me the grapple is where it's at. Kicking things off of stuff is fun, but throwing them off, especially all the absurd power that you do, this is far more entertaining for me. Not all of them are winners. The slide, for instance, feels very rarely useful, and actually makes your controls worse, as once you get it you need to come to a complete halt to crouch down, which comes in handy as the gunfights become more frequent, because sliding out of cover is generally considered poor form in a firefight. Plus, while I complained about the zombie grapples, I never felt like I needed a faster escape. And lastly, while I never got far enough to unlock it, the final stage grants infinite stamina, and yeah, I don't need to have unlocked it to say that would be really fun, as darting around the city and navigating around zombies was probably the most fun I'd had. The final stage of stamina you get before this is fairly sizable, however, and you regenerate it pretty quickly by that point. The power skill tree is a bit more mundane. Most enjoyably, it grants us the ability to chuck our weapons. And whilst there is a thrown weapon slot, it's far more amusing to actually lob your gear at enemies. This is also the tree which grants health upgrades and increases the combat stamina. It also unlocks a bunch of power moves, a charge attack, a ground pound, and a windmill attack. I barely used any of them. I did make use of the 2 instant kill moves regularly, but only by comboing them with agility skills. Survivor is the most passive branch, mostly unlocking new craft recipes, traps, and learning to haggle a bit. Survivor rank also determines how powerful the weapons scattering the game world become, and the weapons' stats are the only things governing damage. Weapons degrade over time, and can only be repaired a certain number of times. There is an upgrade to make that number random, but I never had the same weapon long enough for that to be an issue regardless. The Survivor tree is saved by one addition, however. The grappling hook is so much bloody fun. It flows so well into the running and makes getting around even more enjoyable. I think it's well placed in the tree as well. I got it around the halfway point of the game, just before heading into the second map. I'd equate it with the wingsuit in Far Cry 3, except there's still enjoyable content left by this point of the game, and this only enhances it. It allows me to skip most of those climbing sections I don't like. It's so handy that at points the game has to contrive reasons I can't use it. Most of the time it's an understandable part of the level's intended pacing, other times, however, it's just awful. There was a lot of stuff in this tree that I barely made use out of. Crafted bombs, mines, a shield, and the traps as well. The bombs all pale in comparison to Molotov cocktails, which is quite an early unlock. I rarely needed ranged weapons like throwing stars, and by the time I did, firearms had become common enough that throwing stars were just that bit more antiquated. Plus, in a choice between Molotovs and health kits, both requiring alcohol, generally medkits were more handy. This is a free-roaming zombie game, so scavenging and crafting are present, but save for medkits and lockpicks, I barely crafted anything. It's not like I was hurting for materials either. Whenever I felt like crafting something, I'd always have it on hand, because I actually stopped and picked things up every once in a while. I was also flush with cash for most of the game because, well, my grab everything and sell it mentality was really paying off. There are also weapon blueprints to add elemental effects to weapons. The effects themselves were negligible, but it was handy for the raw damage boost. While I do like the skill trees, they do feel a little poorly spread out in some regards. The early game can feel comparatively sluggish due to low weapon damage, small stamina bars, and limited inventory space. It encourages a careful playstyle where picking your battles and making proper use of the environment and items is paramount. One of the earliest items you're given is firecrackers, and for a long time they remain useful because they distract zombies and, well, you want to get around them, not through them. I enjoyed this stage quite a bit, but considering I restarted my game from beyond the halfway mark to record this review, it did show me just how much things change as you gain levels. By the time you unlock traps and several types of bombs, you'll be powerful enough not to actually need them. By that point, going toe-to-toe with the regular zombies is a snap, and the far more common spike traps don't require a level up. Just some positioning and a good old dropkick. While I did have the shield in my original file, I did not bother with that upgrade at all this time around. The shield slows you down and removes your ability to fight back. It is completely outclassed by the grapple, which allows you to keep moving, keep hitting things, and it opens the enemy up to counter, and both completely negate damage. Even its sole advantage of being able to keep multiple enemies at bay isn't that handy because, well, that's still plain worse than just running away. Ironically, using the shield is more dangerous than just chucking zombies everywhere. As for the weapons in this game, well, the selection's alright. You've joined the tower. You'll help us scrounge for goods, fight zombies, protect us from Rise's men, and all around ensure our continued safety. Here's your table leg. While most weapons of the same general sort only have subtle differences, I did end up finding a few of them uniquely enjoyable. Not everything's handy, however. In the early game there is zero reason to use knives because enemies will just attack right through them, and at no stage did I find the big two-handed bastards handy. Early on they cost too much stamina to actually be useful in a fight, and by the time you have the stamina to tank that, smaller weapons do enough damage to deal with regular zombies without leaving you vulnerable due to long wind downs. The thing is as well, near enough all suitably sized weapons can cleave through crowds and stun zombies for a bit. So knockback and crowd control isn't even that much of an advantage reserved for the big shit. While the large variety does let you pick your poison, and there is probably someone who prefers the two-handed stuff, I couldn't see a reason to use the slower, heavier stuff compared to normal sized weapons. It's for this same reason that I never used any of those power attacks I mentioned. By the time you get them, your regular attacks do enough damage so as to make them worthless, and your grapples and dropkicks handle crowd control nicely. Speaking of crowd control, guns. Well, the selection on hand is a little bit meager. 2 pistols, 1 pistol in a hotel room, a double barrel, and a couple of assault rifles. There is no reason to use anything but the assault rifles. Ammo's actually somewhat common for all of them, if you stop and buy them from the presumably starving survivor communities, but it's even commoner for assault rifles because everyone else uses one. The guns that are there do feel good to use, and while ammo is common during the firefights, you do have to go out of your way for it every other time, and using them out in the open attracts more zombies, particularly virals, the game's branch of special zombies that got the good end of the infection. It is a point in the game's favour that I ended up using melee most of the time, not just because it was practical to do so, but honestly because it's more fun. Said virals include ones that run, ones that spit, ones that explode, ones that are big, and ones that are bigger than that. Other than the last one, I like how they're handled. The runners make a good natural challenge for your own abilities, and early on they're a serious threat due to their advantage in stamina. The spitters are pretty stock, but thanks to your mobility and their somewhat explosive attack, they do force you to move around, and they deny areas well. Their attack also does a surprisingly hefty amount of damage, and it fucks with your vision. The bombers are just fucking badly handled. On the open world they're not so terrible, acting as walking explosive barrels, but in mission interiors the game has a nasty habit of placing them right around doors and corners in already cramped spaces, and their range and damage is nothing to shake a stick at. The big ones get dulled fast due to their predictable attack pattern. Early on they do make a good introduction to dodging, but they do not change beyond that, besides getting a bigger health bar and a somewhat inexplicably large AoE on their slam. The bigger bastards are even worse. They are bull rush enemies, who are capable of instantly stopping a charge and starting a new one, seemingly at random, even if they crash into a wall. They are damage sponges who are faster than they look, and their somewhat lackadaisical animations make them harder to predict and attack than they probably should be. That isn't it, however. The game's tagline was, "Good night, good luck." During the night, the volatiles come out. They are faster than you, stronger than you, and they are numerous. They are stunned by UV light, but it's kinda hard to spread sunlight when they're tearing you apart. Only a handful of objectives force you into contact with them, and that's including side missions I played. The game attempts to incentivize night running by doubling experience gain, but that is hardly a reason to go out of your way for it. They are an interesting foe because they just plain out rank you in every way, and I'm pretty sure they're a decent threat even at max level in all 3 trees. The chases they provide actually push you into skillful use of parkour and trying to quickly scramble to hidey holes. And one of the final segments where you have to outrun a whole horde of them, well, that feels like more of a final boss than, well, the final boss. A group of them can easily wreck you, and while they are killable, it's a lot of effort for not much of a reward. There is a bit of an issue. While in the slums they can be a bit tricky to avoid due to the more varied verticality and wider streets separating rooftops forcing you to ground level at times, in Old Town they only seem to patrol the streets, where running across rooftops is the expected mode of travel and is far easier to do. It basically meant I hardly saw them in the second half of the game, even on nighttime excursions. The other night enemy is the Bolter. You need their DNA for some story shit and side mission shit and crafting shit, and apparently I got enough for all 3 with only 1 harvest, so that's that. The thing is, you can skip every night. Safe houses are everywhere you go, and they're even more common if you unlock them. Night travel is really easily avoided and not much worth it. The day-night cycle was pushed in the marketing, and I do respect that nighttime actually feels imposing. I'd often hurry objectives and prioritise safe houses when I got the warning that night was approaching.
Just wanted to remind you to not be playing heroes in the dark, huh? Get back here or find a safe house. You've got about 1 hour.
But the rewards for actually going into the night really aren't all that much. You level at a pretty decent clip regardless of whether you sleep or not, so I got a few winks in and wasn't much bothered by it. The night zombies are bastards, but they're easily ignored bastards. Besides, somehow night is only about 5 minutes long, which, while it probably saves a ton on light bulbs, is not conducive to a healthy sleeping pattern. It would explain why most of the humans in this city are so pissed off, and it wouldn't be a zombie story if it didn't turn out that humans were the real bastards all along. They're not really though, it turns out the ones that bite indiscriminately are worse. They are fun to murder though, that much is certain. My biggest complaint is that it feels predetermined whether they'll block or dodge a hit you make, rather than down to timing or baiting them. Other than that, they are a refreshing change from the corpses you usually kill. Another problem is that they only come in 2 shapes. Man without gun, and man without gun who has a gun. They lack variety, only using one-handed weapons and assault rifles. They have less variety than the zombies. Where the fuck did all these short swords and assault rifles come from? The one actual boss fight this game has is with a human, but bigger. And it's bad. The enemies with guns aren't bad, but they are brain dead. The AI in this game isn't something to write home about. But if there is one thing that kills a gunfight, it's enemies who treat a fight to the death as casually as this. The 2 sections of Haran we have to muck about in are filled with recent corpse-related things to do. It's at this point I'm going to have to concede something. Dying Light, despite being a successor to Dead Island, more than anything owes its structure to Ubisoft free roamers, which I have shat on in the past. And while I still think they are bloated and shallow, I'm going to have to still give a point to Dying Light for keeping it fun. It's just far more focused and theme appropriate. While Ubisoft throws in a million weird diversions that you can do for tuppence, Dying Light has a handful of side missions that are enjoyable unto themselves. They're not all winners, I'll say that up front, but it never made me do side content as part of the main story. And despite this, it still made sense that the protagonist of Dying Light would stop and do the things the side content offers. Most of the time. In the first half of the game there are supply airdrops over town. This is my favourite side activity by a country mile. After the drop lands, it becomes a race to beat Rise's men to the crate, and most of the time I would drop whatever I was doing and beeline for it. Early on, they are a great opportunity to get survivor points and medkits, and it provides a small running challenge, which, well, I was doing that anyway. In the second half, these go away and are replaced by Rise crates, and they are far less interesting. Basically, every crate is treated like you arrived late, so it's always half the reward and surrounded by armed goons. And rather than the interesting drop, announced by a plane passing overhead, these just pop up on the minimap. I guess Rise's men learned that if they wanted to die, they just had to fill a crate with goodies and wait around for sweet release. There are random survivors and Rise patrols to drop in on in exchange for money and weapon upgrades. Another system for giving raw points to your weapon. I do love how every random survivor is getting bitten and they don't give a shit. We're all dying together, lads. There are also survivors who aren't in danger and by that virtue are a bit more talkative. They, along with the side missions, actually do the more interesting side of the world building and do occasionally set things up that come about in the main plot. Escort missions, I only did one. They exist. They also unfortunately exist outside of this game. Safe houses to liberate from the zombie menace, they're a bit like towers, but a bit lower down. And they have UV lights because some zombies don't like that. There are also combat and agility challenges, basically killing sprees and checkpoint races. I only did 2 or 3 as I didn't really feel much reason to do them. Luckily they seem to exist in isolation from in-game rewards or progress, only giving out experience points. Quarantine zones are like mini instances that pay out survivor points in place of airdrops later in the game. They are generally quite lengthy for a rather small reward. The core gameplay is enjoyable enough in itself to make playing a few palatable, plus they are uniquely mapped and some do have light platforming and puzzle elements. Very light, mind you. And of course there are the side quests. Kyle Crane is a man who has decided that, since he has a camera for a face, he'll just go and solve everyone else's problems. There are a few boring old fetch quests, but it seems the more interesting survivors and scenarios have been saved for side content. A few examples include Dahlia, a witch who can whip up potions to make you invisible to zombies. They're not all winners though.
This isn't good. This is not good at all.
A mentally challenged man named Ghazi, who wants you to fetch some gifts for Mother's Day in exchange for seizure meds for Brecken, who doesn't have seizures either way, but he probably appreciates the thought. And my favourite series of side quests overall, Rupert, a gunsmith who got trapped at a daycare and is pretending to be a wizard to keep the kids' spirits up. You go out and fetch meds for a diabetic girl, do some jobs around the daycare, put Rupert's zombified wife to rest. It's what she would have wanted. It's actually one of the more grounded and low-key series of side quests, but it's done rather well and actually comes off as quite sweet. And it's at this point I feel I should reaffirm, I fucking hate children.
No, sir.
I haven't got a fucking idea what Kyle Crane is doing to this cricket bat that makes it better. I don't know how you apply Fencer to a Bonebreaker cricket bat, but it works. Then Rupert teaches you how to graft fire and lightning to a katana, which is nice. Quite a few of the side quests offer new crafting recipes and unlock further safe houses beyond just giving out experience points, and some side quests lead into plots that span the course of the game. I didn't clear them all due to the fetch quest and sheer breadth of content besides, but while I played, I did have fun with them. And I'm going to say that they do more of the setting of a zombie apocalypse in the side content than they do with the main plot. It's also where Kyle Crane mostly comes off as personable. He does most of the good he does with little expectation of reward, and that is kind of refreshing. On the flip side, he's also a secret agent who uses his own name. Now time for some minor gripes. Most of my other problems with this game are either quite small and rather disparate, so I'm going to throw all of them out now. The lockpicking minigame is bloody boring. It isn't hard by any stretch, it just comes down to trial and error every time. Craft 50 picks and you're good to go for the rest of the game. The issue is that it's also rather frequent, particularly if you stop and loot as I do. The swap weapon function drops whatever you're holding rather than storing it, which is needlessly stupid. The interiors for the missions are a mixed bag. While the game excels at movement-based combat, verticality and parkour, the interiors kind of reject all that for far more static combat and climbing segments, and while some do have a degree of visual polish, far more are quite dull and fittingly lifeless. The visual effects for getting out of water, or getting your face into blood, they're really distracting and hang around for a really long time. The static difficulty of enemies is a bit of a mixed bag. It makes the early game favour evasion and distraction over head-on fighting, but as you start outpacing the difficulty through a combination of your own skill, more powerful weapons, and unlocked abilities, it never really catches up to you. I still died somewhat often, and the game did keep me on my toes, but for the most part you can start skipping the most difficult areas of the game with no difficulty. This isn't entirely a bad thing, and I do appreciate that it doesn't contrive reasons to force you into fights with enemies. Despite the fact they've done it and made it fun, I am basically praising something for following Ubisoft's stead. Now, I'll admit that's petty. I am trying and failing to not let things slide that I called Watch Dogs shit for, and I'll admit it. It's because I like this game. Rise is still really fucking stupid. This last one is more my fault, but if you turn off the motion sickness dot, you have basically made throwing weapons worthless. Meanwhile, firearms and the grappling hook do bring up a crosshair still. My biggest issue with the game is how it handles death. I died quite a few times. I felt like the game did have a good degree of challenge. It is a little bit self-defeating, however. On death you lose some survivor points. A paltry amount of survivor points. It turns out that if you die, you're not a very good survivor. Any enemies you killed do not respawn, and, well, the two bosses in this game barely recover any health. This is alongside somewhat inconsistent checkpointing. I will grant that this game has co-op, and I imagine respawning is what they had in mind, but I played through this entirely in single player, and I do prefer an actual penalty for death. Reset the enemies, prop the pro tag back on his feet, and let me go for take 2. The removal of killed enemies eliminates basically any risk from the gameplay and completely trivializes any challenge. And this is particularly frustrating because, as I brought up, the game is capable of being decently challenging. Besides all that, I was honestly surprised by Dying Light. I picked it up at half price because I'm still a bit of a sucker for zombies and first-person melee and platforming, and I very quickly came to like the game. A problem I've been having with free roamers as of late is that I prefer things to be shorter and more concise, especially as I become more of an impatient bastard. It's also that free roamers tend to have a bunch of gameplay styles, and each feels like a diluted version of what another game does better by focusing solely on that. Dying Light is not entirely free of this. The crafting and combat are admittedly shallow, but it's still satisfying and it ties in well to the parkour, which is very well designed, and the game and map is perfectly suited around it. The running and fighting remained enjoyable for more than 10 hours, which is a pretty mean feat. The side missions and activities felt rooted in the world, save for the challenges which were a little silly. I would recommend Dying Light overall. It's got fun gameplay, a decent breadth of content, and a story you can laugh at or be bored by. Really your choice there.